All right, so continuing from where we left off, talking about how the South became this feudal society of sorts, similar kind of, upper class and slaves being at the bottom there, right? No rights, considered property, as we just mentioned. And you can see this is a painting of a cotton plantation on the Mississippi River. So if you take a look at this, you can see it depicts, this particular plantation having a lot of slaves. You can see many slaves out in the field. You can see slaves, on the wagon or near the wagon. So a lot going on this plantation depicted in this painting. So the demand for slave labor increases, right? Cotton has boomed in the United States. And then in 1807, the United States ends the slave trade. Okay, so what does this mean, ending the slave trade? Well, it certainly does not end slave labor, but it puts an end to the slave trade itself, meaning that no new slaves were imported into the country, at least not legally. There, were some illegal slave ships still trying to import slaves into the country, but it was illegal. It was against the law as of 1807. The U.S. did end the slave trade, meaning no new slaves were legally imported into the country. But at this point, the American South is dependent on a slave economy, right? The slaves were crucial to the plantation system, right? To make those wealthy farmers continuously wealthy, right? You needed that labor to pick cotton and be successful. So wealth in the South was dependent on slaves. Let's take a look at the growth of slavery, because in 1807, right, no new slaves are being imported into the country, but as you can see here, slavery certainly did not decline. Quite the opposite, it grew. So in 1800, there, were just shy of 1 million slaves in the United States. Fast forward 60 years, 1860, nearly 4 million slaves in the United States. Now, sometimes we tend to think that everyone in the South had, owned slaves and, that was the norm. But this pie chart on the right shows us that that wasn't the case. You can see here in the dark red, the amount of Southerners that had no slaves at all. And then here, one slave, right? The amount of people in the South owning one slave as of 1860. This pink color, 2 to 9 slaves. The lighter orange, 10 to 19 slaves. And the darker orange, 20 or more slaves. Those would have been those wealthy plantation owners, right? Owning 20 or more slaves. So slavery in the United States definitely did not decrease as a result of the end of the slave trade. Rather, it increased. Though, again, it was a smaller percentage than some people think that were owning a large amount of slaves. All right, so back to our questions to finish out here. How was slavery a paradox in the United States? How did the invention of the cotton gin transform the South? What is meant by the end of the slave trade in 1807? Well, here we go to answer. Why was slavery a paradox? Well, this was supposed to be land of the free, the United States, land of the free, where all men are created equal. A bit of a paradox in a place where slavery exists, where 4 million people were enslaved, right? And how did the invention of the cotton gin transform the South? Well, the cotton gin was invented in the late 1700s, and that meant there was a massive demand for cotton. People wanted cotton, which meant that there was a demand for labor, particularly slave labor. And that created a boom of not only cotton production in the South, but also slave labor. They were kind of interdependent on one another. And what is meant by the end of the slave trade in 1807? No new slaves were permitted to enter the United States. Though, again, this did not mean that slavery decreased. In fact, it continued to increase. All right, that is it for today for our first Civil War lesson from our 10-day mini Civil War unit. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I look forward to seeing you for day 2. Bye, everyone.